Welcome to our third class of the semester. And what we're going to do today is focus on needs validation with an emphasis on screening. Let's take a look at the steps we want to work through in the next couple of minutes. We'll introduce the FDA waterfall as a context for the needs validation. This might seem a little odd at first, but nonetheless, most people are familiar, most engineers anyway, are familiar with the FDA waterfall context, and I think that adds a nice framework for understanding the role of validation. Then we'll expand on some of the validation components that are often not detailed in the traditional waterfall context. This will, of course, lead to integration of the concepts so we can identify a gap analysis that will actually drive more validation issues. Then we'll summarize and talk about the next step. This is actually a fairly short lecture because section 2.5 of the textbook is very, very critical to read, and it suggests and provides a lot of detail on some of the components that we'll highlight today. And, really, there's no substitute for actually going out and exercising the techniques. So we'll continue to encourage you to go out, make observations, talk, network, and pursue this concept of validation on your own. What'll jump out at you in the in the validation component is that we're still in the identify phase. Of course, we'll follow with the event and implement in this in the weeks ahead. But the emphasis here is on needs screening. So screening and the iterative process of screening is sort of like validation, because what you're going to do is you're going to be asking questions, going out, seeking stakeholder feedback, and refining your needs. And then that needs screening will lead to the selection and specification of a specific need. Again, ultimately, we're working towards the final needs statement. Most biomedical engineers are familiar with the FDA waterfall diagram, and a lot of this begins, we're talking about it a lot, but it begins with the user need. Unfortunately, in many senior design and biomedical engineering design courses, everybody says, oh, just tell me what the problem is, as I've said many times, and we're just going to use the design input. And so typically what happens is typical engineers focus on what we call the verification process, and all of you are familiar with this. And really all it says is the verification is, does the output of the design match the input specifications? And this is a comfort zone for many biomedical engineers because the user need is often fairly vague. And of course, in this particular course, that's our emphasis. Big part of the course is focused on the user need. Well, of course, in this case, validation is saying, does the final medical device, does the final device developed meet the user need, and therefore is it validated? So that's the validation process. A lot of this, of course, we have a continuous review process, but essentially the waterfall diagram sets the stage for this envelope, this outer loop that is often ignored, which is really the validation process, based primarily on the user need and what the medical device is anticipated to be. And so this is again the waterfall process, waterfall diagram, setting the context for validation in a non-traditional way. Let's look at a few validation components, and again, these are expanded on in the book quite a bit. Basically, what you've got is a couple different phases here. You have the various investigations, the method of investigation, and then the output. So let's just take, for instance, anatomy and physiology, right? So you may observe the procedure, conduct interviews, and do a literature study. And these are the methods by which you investigate anatomy and physiology, and you come up with procedures, maps, and user scenarios. And then you test these. The test of that is the validation. Clinical requirements, of course, could be simply obtained from a literature study or a peer-reviewed journal. You want to know what the state of the art is. And of course, the output is the summary of what you learn. And again, this can be tested, which becomes the validation. So again, we're not only talking about technology here, we're talking about business and market analysis. So there'll be other stakeholders involved in helping you develop business reports, doing some competitive benchmarking, or even doing intellectual property and patent searches. And your outcome there, of course, is business feasibility and summary. And there are stakeholders that can help test what you produce. And again, that's a form of validation. Here's another view. Let's take the user needs. Again, remember, you can imagine the FDA waterfall process. Remember, the upper left-hand corner was the user need. On the bottom right-hand side was the, as you recall, would be the device. But let's take a little different view here. And remember these techniques we talked about: the anatomy and physiology, the business and market analysis. So what we do is we've produced. We have these topics in mind, and then what we do is we do sort of a, we start with what we've been given. All right. This represents the research that we have to do, and even though we've come up with a preliminary need statement, we want to reassess the need. We want to break it down into a lot of different into multiple points and see things from multiple angles. So essentially what this represents is a filter. What we're doing is root cause analysis, and the output of all of that is the preliminary form of the needs document. Right? So there may be more than one need, there may be several, but what you have to do is classify and prioritize these needs. And then what you want to do is to say, what solutions are out there? What's currently out in the market? And is there a gap? And so is the need met or is the need unmet? This is a critical part. If we get into unmet needs, then of course we want to clarify the market opportunity and ask ourselves, is there a gap left? If there is a gap left after we've sort of identified this unmet need, then there's probably a little bit more work to do. But basically, the focus is not to solve a problem that's already existed, but to really identify and focus on the unmet needs. What then this does is, then we go back to the need specification, which is the follow-on to the need statement. And the need specification is saying, what should the solution ideally address? What are the constraints? Now we start to translate the user need, which was the upper left-hand corner of the waterfall process, into the design input. And this is where our design requirements come from, and it, of course, leads to an output and a solution, and the solution is verified. So this is a slightly different way of looking at the validation process, but I think it's a little bit stepwise, and it actually follows the textbook quite closely, and this is just a nice way to summarize a lot of pages that are presented in the textbook, worth reading. But again, this talks about basically the sort of the need statement, this idea of a root cause analysis, the document gap analysis, and ultimately the identification of an unmet need, which can then facilitate the design input process. So here we are. Need statements are the starting point for the need specification. We're going to, as we've talked several times, understand disease state fundamentals, existing treatments, stakeholder evaluation, market analysis, and this is going to set up the clinical need, which, having been tested and validated against our stakeholders, is going to produce what we consider to be a specification, and this specification then feeds into the design. So, in summary, validation is a verb, not a noun. This is an action-oriented process. It takes a lot of involvement from people, it takes a lot of iterations, reading, reflection. Many techniques are involved, and it takes time to select the right techniques. Market analysis may not be part of what you have to do. IP analysis may not be relevant. So that list on the left-hand side that we talked about a few slides ago, it might take some time to select the right ones. By default, of course, the person who's starting the process probably wants to go through all of them just to test them and get some experience with them. Validation is an acquired skill. Again, it's a contact sport, and networking is critical. Your ability to come up with, say, an IP's position or a market position, and then the ability to network and find people to help you determine through key opinion leaders whether these are legitimate or not, or whether it's a real gap or it's just a gap you've imagined. This networking is going to be powerful for the validation of what you've produced. It's an acquired skill. So the outcome of all of this is a validated need statement that can then be used to set the specification for the start of design.